Chapter 4. Present. The sound of car tires had long since disappeared before I started back to my house. I wouldn't have gone home then, but my stomach was growling painfully. I'd skipped breakfast with thoughts of birthday cake, and then skipped out on the party altogether. I doubted anyone had noticed with the house filled with people, but it would surely be more obvious now that they'd gone. Leaving the muddied field, I could see the spotlight shining across the wooden gate, which meant Daddy was working on the fence again. The latch had broken last week and we'd found 2 chickens dead in the yard. I'd worried him to death about it since the chicks had hatched. I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to those poor defenseless babies. Pushing through the rickety coop gate, I tracked through the mud to be sure no tragedies had struck since I'd checked this morning. "Did you hear them howling again?" I called out, combing my fingers through my windswept hair as I rounded the fence. Thomas's eyes flashed up from where he stooped with a hammer in one hand and a fence post in the other. I froze on the spot. "I thought you were Daddy," I said, hugging my chest against the sudden chill that rocked me. "He's back at the house," he said, around the nail he held between his teeth. Before I could utter another word, the loud thump of the hammer echoed through the air. I watched him for a moment, trying to think of something else to say, waiting for him to say something, anything that would get us past the awkwardness that radiated between us like an invisible force field. Words had never been our problem before, but I was at a loss, and except for a raised brow, probably because I'd been staring at him so long, so was he. I lay awake for hours trying to quiet my restless mind. So many unanswered questions swirled about, and of course my mind had to play out each possible scenario until I felt the need for a psychiatrist. When I finally found sleep, I also found Thomas, which was nothing unusual. I dreamt of Thomas more often than not, which was why I hadn't dated since he'd left. It was hard to see anyone else with his face fresh in my mind each morning. It was pathetic. And what was even more pathetic was trying to go back to sleep this morning to be with the dream version of him when he was right down the hall. Loving him all these years had been like running after a flyaway balloon. No matter how clearly I could see him, he was always just out of reach. I took longer than necessary to get dressed the next morning, finally pulling on a pair of denim cutoffs, my favorite red button-up tank, and my trusty boots. My chores were waiting, and I hoped my breakfast was too. My stomach growled noisily as I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs. I'd smelled the rich aroma of coffee and bacon over an hour ago. Mama was a saint, pulling a dish towel off the plate on the stove as I walked into the kitchen. "Saved you some toast, and what I could of the bacon," she said, eyeing me curiously. I was never late for breakfast. "Your Daddy and Thomas finished off the eggs, and these grits," she said, hitting a cake spoon on the side of the pot in her hand, "could fix the crack in the walkway." I wrapped the toast around the bacon, too hungry to care. I would have eaten bran flakes at this point, and I hated bran flakes. "Is there coffee left?" She was one step ahead of me, pushing the bowl of sugar over to a steaming mug. "Katie called you before good daylight," she sighed. "That's the 3rd time this week." "Did she wake Daddy?" She shook her head. "No, he was already in the fields, but that's hardly the point. My stomach knots when the phone rings that early. It's not how I like to start my morning." I finished the coffee quickly, though it scorched my tongue. Getting fussed at was not exactly how I like to start my morning. The chicken coop looked much neater than I was used to. Someone had cleaned. There were only 6 eggs today. After the last haul, I wasn't surprised. Mama took the basket from me and headed back to the house while I squished through the mud to the big barn. It wasn't as clean. I pushed the doors wide so the smell of manure wouldn't be so overwhelming. Flies swarmed my legs while I shoveled out the mess in the stalls. I should have worn pants, but it was just too hot. By the time I finished, I'd grown used to the smell, or grown one with it. I grabbed the heavy brush and stroked Adeline's swishing tail. She grew still before stomping her leg and shaking her head. I felt like it was her equivalent to a stress-releasing sigh. She was mine, more so than any of the other horses. They were all on my chore list, but Addie wasn't so much a job. We got each other, and she knew things even Katie didn't know about me. She knew every time I'd snuck out of the house after curfew to meet up with Thomas, and when Thomas left, it was her smooth frame that kept me together. I knew her just as well, how she liked to be brushed, how much she liked sweet cereal, and that if her blanket was forgotten on a cold night, she was untouchable the next day. The afternoon sun came in heated streaks through the slanted roof of the barn, I twisted my t-shirt into a knot and tightened my ponytail. It helped that it was windy. The wind rustled the stray hay hanging from the bales, blowing it across the ground, but it never lasted long enough to stop the sweat on my neck. I let Addie, Arnold, and Allendale out of their stalls and led them to the front pen. They didn't need me to find it. They made this same track every day. My returning customers, Michelle and her sister Morgan, were already waiting with their mom. They'd paid for the next 6 months of lessons in advance. Half the money went back toward the horses' upkeep. My half was still a nice chunk of change tucked safely beneath my mattress. I really needed to look into a checking account before fall. Michelle was big enough now to mount Allendale all by herself. He was a sweet horse, but not as patient as Addie. That's why I saved Addie for Morgan. Morgan was only 5 and just starting out. Last week had been the first lesson she'd actually ridden and not cried for her mama. I gave some standard instructions to Michelle, never taking my hand off Addie. Addie had never started without approval before, but stranger things had happened, and Daddy drilled me about lawsuits before he'd agreed to let me start giving lessons. Morgan stayed on long enough for her mama to get pictures and then was ready to get off. As soon as I helped her to the ground, she took off to the fence to pet the goats. "Careful, Morgan. They'll taste that sucker on your hand and mistake you for a snack," I kidded as she giggled. Her mama didn't get the joke, pulling her quickly out of the goats' reach. They weren't farm people. I took Michelle out to jump. It wasn't really so much a jump as it was a high step, but her mama squealed with delight when she did it. It was a long 45 minutes with no shade, and I was relieved when their Buick wasn't blocking our drive anymore. Allendale and Arnold trotted back to the barn as soon as I opened the gate. I dumped out the warm, fly-trapping water and replaced it with fresh. Addie was waiting on me when I got back. I adjusted her saddle into place and climbed on. Like breakfast this morning, I didn't feel the need to rush. The wind swept the stray hairs away from my heated face as I rounded the house. Daddy smiled on his way up the back steps. I could feel another set of eyes on me, too. I nudged Addie to go faster. Then we were flying by the tall, swaying corn stalks and through the grassy field that led the way to the trees. I didn't go as far as the river. I cut back to the left and headed toward the blinding haze that hid Katie's house. Her golden retriever caught sight of me long before she did. "I called you!" Katie yelled from the blanket where she read to John Tyler. He used her temporary distraction to slip away, running toward the treehouse. "Thanks for that," I grimaced, slowing Addie. "Mama raked me over the coals this morning for your wake-up call." Katie was much cleaner than I was, and her pale yellow sundress looked cooler too as it ruffled in the warm breeze. Babysitting wasn't the best job, but from the looks of it, it beat shoveling the barn. "Sheesh, Breland," she started, her eyes as round as saucers as her bare feet patted over to me. "You're lucky I wasn't banging on your front door." "Why?" I asked, quickly pulling on the reins. I never dreamed Katie was calling about anything serious. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" She eyed me like I was harboring a national secret. Crossing her arms, she stared rather severely. "I know Thomas is at your house." "How?" "Because I saw him get off the bus yesterday." She cut me off. "I almost missed him. Mama and the boys had already gone into the theater, but that new usher made me go back to the car and unload my bag. Can you believe that? I mean, so what if butter was dripping out the bottom? It's not like that burnt orange carpet is clean." "Katie, you didn't," I grinned, picturing butter running down her legs as she argued with the poor usher. "What did you have in there?" "Just some baggies of popcorn," she said defiantly with a hand on her hip. "That pimply-faced kid couldn't have been more than 15. I should have dumped it on his head." "You went all the way back to the car for that?" I asked, pulling back on Addie, who'd caught sight of a bumblebee. "Why didn't you just throw it away?" Her cheeks turned red as she shuffled her feet like a child. "I might have had some candy bars, a couple of corn dogs, and a drink, too." Her appetite never ceased to amaze me. "Don't look at me like that," she insisted. "It wasn't all for me. Anyway, who cares about some stupid corn dog? What is it like having Thomas back?" She was practically bouncing. "Tell me everything. What did you say to him? What did he say to you?" She clutched at her heart dramatically like she might fall over with a heart attack. "We can go on double dates now." I shifted my weight uncomfortably. Addie's body seemed to have grown stiffer beneath me. I wouldn't make any reservations just yet. Her face clouded over as another breeze lifted her blonde hair from her shoulders. Oh no, what happened? Nothing happened, I muttered. We shook hands and... Shut the front door, she deadpanned, her eyes growing 3 sizes. You shook hands? It's been years, Katie, I explained, trying to sell her what I'd only recently bought myself. We aren't the same people anymore. He's different. He didn't look that different to me, she said with the tilt of her head. A little scruffier, maybe, but I thought it worked for him. He was probably just surprised to see you is all. She was wrong, but I didn't tell her that. It was hard enough to stomach the changes myself. He couldn't have been more different. Are you going to invite me over for dinner? Katie asked, her face expectant. I was sort of hoping you'd ask me over, I sheepishly admitted. Now she was clearly assessing my mental state. You want to eat here? With my family? I tried to make my smile look authentic, glancing back at my house. I could see Daddy's hat, no bigger than the tip of my fingernail, moving in the yard. Of course, I haven't been over here in what, like weeks? You can't avoid him forever, she sang with a knowing smile as she plucked a clover from the grass and proceeded to tear the petals off one at a time. And why would you want to? There's no one to avoid, I sighed. Right, she said. Her dimple prominent as she fought a smile. She clearly didn't believe a word I was saying. Doesn't matter anyway. We're going to Granny's for dinner. If you don't save me, I'm destined for a pot of pintos and a pan of cornbread. She made a disgruntled face, but steak wouldn't have sounded any better to me right then. Anything sounded better than going home. What do you say? She asked, still sounding encouraged. Invite me over? Tell your granny I said hey, I called over my shoulder as Addie carried me back across the trampled wildflowers in the overgrown field. The sun was just starting to set when I put Addie in the barn. She always seemed smug after a day of riding, holding her head high as she passed the other horses. I double-checked the stable locks and peeked up at the kitchen window. It was bright, and I couldn't see any heads moving about. No doubt they'd already started eating. I untied my shirt and trudged up the back steps. Everyone looked up when I walked in. I self-consciously smoothed my hair back, feeling the tangled mess the ride had left me with. Daddy and Thomas had clearly already showered and changed clothes. I glanced down at my riding boots. They were splattered with mud, and much, much worse. There were even streaks of orange dirt across my thigh. Bree stinks, Jenny giggled, her face covered in spaghetti sauce as she attempted to twirl a noodle around her small fork. Yes, ma'am, Mama agreed. She sure does. Where have you been, Breland? I rang the bell over an hour ago. Was she really scolding me for coming to dinner late? Had I stepped into a time warp? We'd barely managed to eat together at all lately, and nowhere close to a reasonable time. I went to see Katie. Well, don't just stand there tracking mud all over the place, she frowned with a wave of her hand. Take those boots off and go get a shower. I'll save you some chicken. I trudged upstairs, barely glancing at the mess in the bathroom mirror that stared back at me, before claiming the hot water. It took more than one scrubbing to get the grime out of my chipped nails. When I stepped out of the shower, the tub looked like I'd thrown Katie's retriever in with me. I tucked the towel underneath my arm and washed the red dirt down the drain. I'd just started combing my hair when the door pushed open. My mistake, Thomas said, his t-shirt drawing out the green in his eyes, which had widened indefinitely. He took a cautious step back. The water's turned off in my bathroom, I said pointedly, gripping the towel closer to my chest. There's a leak. I fixed it this morning, he said, looking at me longer than he had since he'd arrived. I waited for him to close the door, but he waited too. If you're finished here, he started. Right. Realizing I was blocking the door, I hurriedly stepped out of the way and walked quickly to my room, contemplating another shower. Humiliation was thicker than mud.